And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and we're talking about some more Lost Caverns of Ixalan cards. I already made a video about what I think are essentially the best cards from the set. They're going to be the Commander staples. They're going to be the ones that we're definitely going to be seeing all the time. So go check out that video if you haven't. There's a whole bunch more to talk about, right? This is actually a really good Commander set. In fact, you know, if I was being critical, I would say this wasn't maybe the best year ever for Commander cards. Not that we need a bunch more. Again, I'm not complaining, but this might be the best set that we've gotten this year for Commander. The Lord of the Rings set was really good. I really like the Lord of the Rings set, particularly because it had a lot of great reprints, though. That's one of the things that made it a really great Commander set for me. Just as far as unique cards go that are just going to go in lots of decks, this might be the best set we've gotten this year. So great way to close out the year, I guess. And again, in the last video, mostly the Commander staples, the stuff that can go in every deck. This video is going to be more about the specific stuff. So maybe tribal, archetype specific, the things that are not going to go in every deck, but the stuff that definitely needs to get talked about and is certainly going to see play in the format on various levels. So let's get to it. And I'm going to start out with Roaming Throne because I've been asked about this one a bunch, funny enough. I'm not sure why. I've had at least 3 or 4 comments on my videos saying, hey, what about the Roaming Throne? Have you talked about that yet? I haven't. This will be my first opportunity to do so. Roaming Throne is a 4-mana artifact creature golem, 4/4, ward 2. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Roaming Throne is the chosen type in addition to its other types. If a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. So it's a tribal card, and I'm wondering why people wanted me to talk about this particularly. I mean, there's a lot of tribal stuff. Obviously, we got the dinosaurs, the merfolk, the vampires, and the pirates, right? So there's a lot of tribal themes here. I'm not going to really cover any of the very tribal specific stuff because obviously, you know, if something says your merfolk creatures have flash, I think we know where that's going, right? Don't really need to talk about that stuff. This is not tribal specific, obviously, but it is a tribal card. Or is it? Like, I'm looking at this card and I'm thinking, you know, we're getting to a point now where there's so much support. Like, again, I have a patron who has a Kumena deck who just was, I was talking to on the Discord, who said, you know, some card that was mentioned from this said, oh, I'm going to have to find room for that in the deck. And I'm like, man, you're going to have to find a room for a lot of cards if you have a Kumena deck, right? There's a lot of commanders out there that there's so much support from this set and many others that I'm not going to find room for this card. Again, if I'm in one of those big tribes, like the soldiers or the goblins or the dragons or the whatevers, no way I'm finding room for this card unless my commander has a triggered ability, right? Because of course this is a Panharmonicon for triggered abilities here. So if my commander has a triggered ability in that tribe, then this is great because my commander's ability will trigger again. But also if I just happen to have, right? I'm not going to throw this in my merfolk or my vampire deck. You got to look through your deck, right? And make sure it's actually worth it to put it in there. I also, though, think this card is very much usable in any deck where you have a commander with a really good triggered ability. The fact that it turns into that creature type might not be very usable. Like I'll throw Drakuseth out there, right? There is a creature with a really, I mean, it's an expensive commander. You'd love to get a extra triggered ability from your commander, right? Just think of it as a Strionic Resonator, right? Basically, this card you can think of as a Strionic Resonator. Just name whatever your commander's creature type is, right? Getting that double trigger off my Drakuseth every time it attacks. Getting that double trigger off of my Mathis on my end step, right? There's another commander that, you know, I'm only getting that trigger once a turn. I'd love to have it another one, right? I say that all the time about Strionic Resonator, where if I got a commander that only triggers once every turn or once every turn cycle, so once on my turn, on my upkeep or on my end step, that is where I might want to throw a Strionic Resonator in, and I might also want to throw this in as well. So maybe tribal, sure, but I would definitely look at this card for just my commander has a really great triggered ability that I want to get another one on my turn. All right, let's move on. Helping Hand, 1 white mana sorcery, return target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So I think it deserves a mention. It's not super splashy. If you have a commander that is white, that is 3 mana value or less, I think this is a pretty easy slot in. Like, I would try to find room for it. Imagine your commander costs 2. I got a Shanna deck, right? I'm going to put this in there. It's sort of the theme of the deck as well. So rather than my commander dies, goes back to the command zone, and I pay 4 or more, now I just pay 1, right? So, I mean, Pretty easy slot in. I mean, you could almost replace your command beacon with this if you have a command beacon. I mean, obviously command beacon's a land, but you know what I mean? Just a very easy way to get your commander back if it dies. So it's going to go on all those decks. Next up, Poetic Ingenuity, 2 and a red enchantment. Whenever one or more dinosaurs you control attack, create that many treasure tokens. So again, we're in the tribal theme, but let's try to look outside of that. If you have a commander that's a dinosaur and you're not doing tribal, whenever it attacks, you create a treasure token. That's not bad. But this other ability is pretty darn good. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 3/1 red dinosaur creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. So that seems pretty good in an artifact deck, right? And obviously because I'm creating those dinosaurs, when they attack, I will get a treasure. So I can very easily play this in a, whatever red artifact deck. I don't know, mono red, a Duretti deck maybe. I cast an artifact on my turn. I get that 3/1 dinosaur. Then the next turn I attack with it and it gives me a treasure token. It's just really fantastic value to something you're already doing in your deck already. So don't shy away from this if you're not doing dinosaur tribal. It might be a great fit in your red artifact deck. All right, moving on. Sunbird Standard. This is a really interesting card. 3 mana artifact, tap, add 1 mana of any color. So once again, as I just talked about in the last video, we are in that zone of the 3 mana artifact that adds 1 mana of any color, for which there are 100 in the format. And people have shied away from it, but I think people are starting to go towards it again because a lot of these add some really nice advantages for you. And I just talked about one in the last video that I think, if you're going to have a 3 mana rock, maybe you got a Commander Sphere in your deck, replace it with that because maybe it's fitting better, right? It's giving your creature maybe only your commander flash, but might be totally worth it. And the same might be true here. However, this one I think is a lot more specific. So tapping to add 1 mana of any color. Great. Okay. Craft with 1 or more, 5. All right. So what does that mean? I pay 5 mana, exile this artifact, exile 1 or more other permanents, any other permanents. So that's not very specific. Could be anything. You control or cards from your graveyard. So it's very easy to transform this guy. Return this card transformed under owner's control. Do it only as a sorcery. And on the backside, it's a creature. Sunbird Effigy. Artifact creature, bird construct, has flying, vigilance, and haste. That's pretty good. And its power and toughness are equal to the number of colors among the exiled cards used to craft it. So this card you probably want specifically in decks with more colors, right? If I have this in a monocolored deck, I'm only going to have 1 color. I don't think it's possible to get more than 1 color here, right? So its power and toughness are equal to the number of colors among the cards. So it's only 1, right? It's going to be a 1/1, flying, vigilance, haste. That doesn't seem worth my 5 mana. And then also tap for each color among the exiled card used to craft Sunbird Effigy, add 1 mana of that color. So I'm just adding 1 mana, 1 white mana or something. That doesn't seem great, right? However, on the other end of the spectrum, this seems fantastic in a 5-color deck, right? So now, and again, I can exile 1 card that is 5 colors. And if I got something in my graveyard, that's fine. Or I can exile a bunch of cards that equal up to 5 colors. And if I get the 5 colors, now I've got a 5/5 flying, vigilance, haste creature. That's pretty fantastic. But it also taps to add Wooburg, essentially, right? Because it's going to add each color among the exiled card used to craft it. So it taps to add Wooburg. That's fantastic. And of course it has vigilance as well. So I can very easily flip this guy, attack with it immediately, and then on my second main phase, tap it for mana. It's hard to find room in any 5-color deck nowadays, but this seems like a pretty neat include in there. All right, moving on to another white card. And yes, I've mentioned a lot of white cards in the last video, and I'm going to mention a bunch more here. White, I think, made out best in this set. I had a guy in the last video say, oh man, you can really tell Demo really likes the white cards. It's more so for me, yes, if I had to pick a favorite color, I'd say it's probably white, mostly because of the removal. But for me, it's just the constant complaining about white. And I'm just like, I don't get it. Every set, we're just getting all these fantastic white cards. And for sure, I would say white made out the best in this set. Red probably second. Again, I talked about a lot of great red cards in the last video, and I'm going to talk about a lot of really great red cards in this video as well. So white probably made out the best here. Red second. I would say green's at the bottom. I don't know if I talked about any green cards in the last video, and I don't know if I'm talking about any green ones here. If you're doing dinosaur or merfolk tribal, you got a bunch of stuff, but because the green concentrated on that stuff, there's not a lot of stuff that's going to fit with everybody, right? You know what I mean? So I think for that reason, green might have made out the worst in this set. That's just my opinion. So from the rubble, 4 white enchantment. That's kind of a lot. As from the rubble enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. So again, we're doing the creature type thing. But at the beginning of your end step, return target creature card of the chosen type from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. And I haven't talked about finality counters I didn't talk about my last video, so I'm glad that I'm covering it here because it's another mechanic new to this set. If a creature with a finality counter on it would die, exile it instead. And of course, as I talked about, I think in a spoiler video, you can remove those counters, right? If you have a way to remove the counters from your creatures, then it just comes back and it stays back, right? Probably this is the best fit in a tribal theme, and I guess any tribal theme. And again, we're in that situation where if I'm in a vampire tribal deck that, that has white or soldier tribal, like human tribal, there's so much support there already. And also so many great creatures that, am I going to find room for this? It might be tough. This one I would say is more tribal. I don't think I would find room for this just for my commander to get it back. Maybe, I don't know. If your commander's really expensive, might be worth it because it comes back. You're basically skipping over a commander tax, right? It comes back with the finality counter. If you can't get rid of it, it gets exiled, goes to the command zone, then you play it again, then back to the graveyard, then use this, right? So I don't know if that's worth it. Probably not. Maybe for some people it would be. Here, this is probably more a tribal theme, but cards like this, when I see them, I'm thinking a underwhelming tribe is where I want this. I don't think the vampires need this. I don't think the soldiers need this. I'm probably going to play this in a white tribe that is an underwhelming one, whatever that may be. Let's talk about Scythe Claw Raptor. I like this card a lot. 2 and a red, dinosaur 4/3. So of course it's a dinosaur. You could put it in the dinosaur tribal decks, but I like it outside of that. Whenever a player casts a spell, if it's not their turn, it deals 4 damage to them. That's pretty darn good. Anyone who hates those counter spells, right? A lot of people that are not playing on their turn, this happens like 4 damage. That's not nothing. Even in a commander game, 4 damage, that hurts after a couple times, right? So this is not going to stop your opponents from countering your stuff, but it's certainly going to make them pay for it. If you're in a very aggro-y theme, if I'm playing against a guy who's in an aggro-y theme, I got my path or my swords or whatever, and I'm holding it up for their turn. Because when they attack on their turn, I know they're going to attack. They're in an aggro theme. Are they going to attack me? If they don't, good, I'll save my removal for some other day. If they do, now I'm going to cast my swords on their creature so it doesn't hit me, and I'm going to take 4 damage for my trouble, right? So I really like this card in a lot of decks, but more so in the I'm dealing non-combat damage theme. Even though this card seems very niche, I think it fits nicely into the I'm throwing damage around, dealing non-combat damage to my opponents, that kind of stuff. It might be a neat fit in some of those decks. All right, Terror Tide, 2 black sorcery. All creatures get -X until end of turn, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So where does this stack up for black board wipes? I've mentioned on my channel a couple of times now, Toxic Deluge is one of the best board wipes in the format. You could argue it's the best if we're just talking about a creature board wipe. Where do you go from there? They get really expensive. A lot of people say Decree of Pain. Okay, that's 8 mana, in Garrick's Wake. Like, you got the really, really expensive ones. And then you have the ones like Mutilate that are very specific. If I'm not in a mono black deck, Mutilate might be great in a mono black deck. If I'm getting to 2 colors now, that gets a lot worse, right? So for me, like a Nightmare Unmaking is one I play a lot. That, in a mono black deck, I think it's pretty good. I like the workaround there where I can advantage it me. But if I just want a board wipe that's going to kill all the creatures, not a lot of great options in black, in my opinion, that aren't really expensive. And I think this is a pretty great option. -X, of course, is one of the best ways to get rid of creatures because it gets around indestructible, hexproof, and everything, right? X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So, early in the game, it's probably not going to be great. Although, maybe I got 3 cards in my graveyard. I can cast this on turn 4. It might actually hit all the creatures. If I got some opponents with aggro decks that are getting off to a good start. Later in the game, it's just going to get everything, probably. Likely, unless someone has Bajuka Bog me or something like that. Obviously, if you're self-milling, graveyard strategies, it might be extra good. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, this is right up there as far as black board wipes in the format now. All right, moving on to another red card. Again, a lot of great red cards in this set as well. Sunshot Militia, 1 and a red human soldier, 1/3. Tap 2 untapped artifacts and or creatures, deals 1 damage to each opponent. Activate only as a sorcery. Now, unfortunately, the activate only as a sorcery makes this card a lot worse. It means you got to tap the stuff down on your turn. This card, I think, would be bonkers if it was activate it whenever you want, because you just leave all your stuff up and then on your opponent's end step before your turn, just tap everything down, deal a bunch of damage to my opponents, and then I'll untap and repeat, right? That would just be way too easy, and this card would be way too good. I'm okay with the stipulation there. This is artifacts or creatures, and of course, for that reason, it fits in any deck where you just got lots of artifacts and or creatures lying around. Even in a deck like, say, a Krenko deck. I mean, I don't know if I'd find room for this in a Krenko deck. Again, there's a tribe that already has too much support. But just as an example, I have a lot of those tokens lying around, and a lot of times you can get to the situation where, my opponents all got blockers, so attacking them with 1/1 or even 2/2 tokens is just not that great. Now I have a way to use them. Now I can just start, okay, I don't have to attack anymore. Or my opponent has a sphere of safety, right? This is a great backup for that kind of situation where my opponent's got a sphere of safety and like 8 enchantments in play. I'm in a mono red deck. There's no way I'm attacking them and I can't get the sphere of safety off the battlefield. Now I can get around it. I can just start tapping down my giant army of goblins and dealing my opponent's damage directly. Or again, with the artifacts, right? I got a bunch of treasure tokens in play or whatever, food tokens, and I'm not really using them anymore. I don't need the mana. Just start tapping them down to deal damage. I like this card a lot. It is specific, but I think it's going to go in a lot of decks, probably in a couple of my decks. On a similar theme, Gold Fury Strider, 4 and a red, artifact creature golem, 3/5 with trample. Tap to untap artifacts and or creatures you control. Target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Activate as a sorcery. So second verse, same as the first. Basically a very similar theme here. Maybe this one fits better in your deck. Maybe the other one does. Maybe you're going to put both. I have a Lulu deck that is red, that is tapping creatures, and I might have to find room for both of these, although it's getting tight in that deck. This guy's got trample, so obviously you can use the ability on himself, right? If you just tap 2 untapped artifacts or creatures you control, any combination thereof, this guy becomes a 5/5 with trample, and you can really start going to town. Maybe you got some other creatures, right? Maybe you just have a deck where you have a commander that you really want to bump up its power, and you throw this guy in there and just start tapping down all your mana rocks and all your creatures to make your commander enormous and give it a really big power. A lot of commanders out there that just want to have a really big power that, maybe this is a great fit there for that reason. So tough to say which one is going to go in more decks. This might go in more decks just because, again, there are those commanders out there that just want a big power. And this is a great way to bump up your commander's power if you're looking for an option there. All right, let's talk about Illustrious Wanderglyph, 4 and a white. Artifact creature golem. Definitely a lot of golems in this set. 2/2. With Ascend, we're revisiting that ability again. If you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. Other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2 as long as you have the City's Blessing. So that's pretty good. So as soon as you get up to 10 permanents, which in a commander game isn't that difficult, all your artifact creatures get +2/+2. And at the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature token. And if this card seems familiar, it is essentially Tendershoot Dryad in white for artifact creatures, right? Very similar, almost identical, I would say. Just white one doing it for artifact creatures. So again, you can do this in the artifact creature theme, which there's a bunch of decks there. You can just do it though, where I just have this card. There's a huge token theme in this set, and man, it's my Benny Brax deck I got a lot of thinking to do there, because this is a very easy one to slot in my Benny Brax deck, because at the beginning of each upkeep, a token gets spit out by this guy that then fulfills my commander, and I get to draw a card in the end step. So pretty hard for me not to put it in there. And then once I get up to the Ascend, to the City's Blessing, all those tokens then become 3/3s, right? Anyone who's had that Tendershoot Dryad in a game knows you don't need to do Sapperling Tribal at all. You just have that guy come down, he just spits out tokens, and you just go to town. So this guy, again, fits in specific themes, but pretty great in a lot of decks as well, I think. All right, moving on, getting to the more splashy stuff, I would say, towards the end of this video. Bringer of the Last Gift, 6 black vampire demon, 6/6 with flying. When Bringer of the Last Gift enters the battlefield, if you cast it, each player sacrifices all other creatures they control. Then each player returns all creatures from their graveyard that weren't put there this way to the battlefield. So this is essentially Living Death, which of course is an incredibly powerful card in the format and a lot of other formats, on a creature. This is Living Death stapled on a creature, right? All the creatures that are currently in play get sacrificed, which, again, unless you're playing a Sigarda deck, pretty tough to get around that, right? Then whatever's currently in the graveyard, you're going to put back into play, right? Just like a Living Death that I'm sure we've all seen in action, Works great in those graveyard strategies, those Marin decks, those Sidisi decks that are filling their graveyards with creatures. Typically, it's just game over if someone doesn't have an immediate board wipe. This is stapled on a creature. You have to cast it, obviously. It's a neat card. I don't know. How much play is this going to see? I'm not exactly sure. I guess also it is forcing everyone to sacrifice. So any of those commanders that want sacrifice triggers, which I believe we have a couple now, probably a great fit there as well. All right, threefold Thunderhulk, 7-mana artifact creature gnome 0/0. And I'll just say, if anyone was thinking of making a gnome tribal deck, there's an underwhelming tribe. We got enough support now that you could maybe do it. And I had my patron mention on the Discord, what's up with all these artifact creature gnomes, right? Because typically, I guess, outside of Magic, gnomes are actual creatures that run around. We got the D&D gnomes when they printed the gnomes from the crossover D&D material. Of course, in D&D, gnomes are actual little creatures that run around. But traditionally in Magic, gnomes are artifact creatures. There's lots throughout the history of Magic the Gathering that are actually artifact creatures. That has been the case always with Magic. So they've sort of revisited that whole thing here. Threefold Thunderhulk enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. When Threefold Thunderhulk enters the battlefield or attacks, create a number of 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens equal to its power. When it initially enters the battlefield, right? 7 mana is a lot, but as soon as this guy enters the battlefield, he'll be a 3/3 and will immediately create those 3 1/1 gnome artifact creature tokens. So that's not bad. For 7 mana, not too shabby. You can pay 2, sacrifice another artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on Threefold Thunderhulk. And I will just say, if you got a lot of mana, or maybe you're reanimating this guy with your Goblin Welder, right? You can cheat him into play. You can respond to your own enter the battlefield trigger here, right? Whenever this enters the battlefield or attacks, you're going to create those gnome tokens, and that's going to go on the stack. So I Goblin Welder this guy into play. I put that ability on the stack, of course, and then I respond to my own ability by paying 2 and sacrificing a couple. Maybe I pay 4, sacrifice a couple of artifacts, put a couple counters on this guy. Now when this ability resolves, he is now a 5/5 and I get 5 tokens. So neat little interaction there. It might be tough to do, but you can do it. For that reason, any of those Goblin Welder decks, which I do have one myself, probably going to be a great fit. Maybe, again, a Duretti deck where you're doing that graveyard recursion with stuff. You're giving yourself those tokens, which are artifacts that you can use to sacrifice. Any sacrifice artifact theme probably is going to really like this guy a lot. Maybe the +1/+1 counter theme, because maybe you're piling +1/+1 counters on your other creatures. I mean, if I got a Hardened Scales, again, this might seem like a weird fit in a deck like that, but if I got a Hardened Scales, this guy enters the battlefield, immediately has more counters on them. And then when he attacks, again, things get out of hand really, really fast in a deck like that as well, right? Doubling Season. Oh my goodness, this guy gets really out of hand with a Doubling Season, right? You're going to get giant armies of gnome artifacts very, very quickly with a Doubling Season, right? So even though this feels very much like artifact creature tribal or artifact tribal, sacrifice artifact, sure, you might want to give it consideration for some of those Doubling Season +1/+1 counter decks as well. All right, I'm going to end off this video with a bunch of really fun, interesting legendary artifacts. There's a bunch of legendary artifacts from this set. It's a little bit of the theme of the set. And there's a bunch of really big splashy ones that, I think they're fun. They're interesting. How popular they're going to be, I don't know. But there's definitely some really fun cards that can fit into certain commander decks that are going to be interesting in a lot of different commander games. And I'm going to talk about a bunch of them here to close out this video. So the Ever-Flowing Well, 2 and a blue, legendary artifact. When it enters the battlefield, mill 2 cards, then draw 2 cards. So 3 mana, draw 2 cards. That's not terrible. No, we're already off to a pretty good start here. Descend 8. So at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, transform the Ever-Flowing Well. And that's not that hard to do. Getting to 8, not that hard at all. So we're going to flip it over and it becomes a land. The Myriad Pools, legendary artifact land. Keep in mind this is an artifact land. And the same with the other one that I mentioned in the last video. Dies to a Vandal Blast, right? Krosan Grip, all of that. So just do keep that in mind. Tap, add a blue mana. Whenever you cast a permanent spell using mana produced by the Myriad Pools, up to one other target permanent you control becomes a copy of that spell until end of turn. That's pretty interesting. How would you use this? I don't know. I guess you could use it in a lot of different ways. Like, I'm just thinking, I have a land in play, right? So I just have a basic island sitting there. I cast a big splashy creature and I can then, because this is a cast trigger, right? Your thing that you're casting, let's say it's a Hullbreaker Horror. That's on the stack right now, right? I'm casting a permanent spell using mana produced by this, so that's still in the stack. This ability triggers. Up to one other target permanent you control becomes a copy of that spell. So my island, my basic island, is now going to become a Hullbreaker Horror until end of turn, right? So obviously if it wasn't until end of turn, this would be insanely busted. Until end of turn, I have now 2 Hullbreaker Horrors in play. So that's pretty good, right? So there's some interesting shenanigans you can get into here for sure with the copying. Got to be careful, of course, with the legendary thing. If I copy a legendary spell, as soon as that legendary creature enters the battlefield, I'm going to have to get rid of one. So I'm probably not going to get much of a benefit. It's a really interesting card. I'm not sure I would find room for this anywhere. I don't know. Like, again, looking at the front, maybe you want to be milling yourself, I guess. Maybe you just plan on having lots of stuff in your graveyard, so it's going to be easy to flip this guy, and then you could just get some nice value off of this, right? There's not a lot of drawback, or it's not hard for you to flip it. Pretty easy to slot this into your deck, and then I just have a land that I can just copy spells if I want to. Pretty neat card. All right, another mono blue legendary artifact here, the Enigma Jewel, 1 blue mana. That's pretty cheap. Legendary artifact, enters the battlefield tapped. Tap, add 2 colorless. Spend this only to activate abilities. That's pretty interesting. So without getting onto anything else here, if I have a commander that has an activated ability that has the 2 colorless, Locust God, I'm thinking, right? That there are a few out there, might want to find room for that reason. I could just use that mana to activate my commander's ability, right? However, you're more likely going to put it into the deck for this craft ability. Craft with 4 or more non-lands with activated abilities. Craft with 4 more, just non-lands. Okay. 8 and a blue. That's a lot of mana, right? 9 mana is a lot. So obviously we're going to get a lot for what's on the back. So I'm going to pay 9 mana. I'm going to exile this and exile 4 or more among other permanents you control or cards in your graveyard. Again, very weird wording there. So you're just going to exile 4 non-land cards from the battlefield or from your graveyard. And then you're going to transform this guy only as a sorcery, and it becomes Locus of Enlightenment. Legendary artifact again, Locus of Enlightenment has each activated ability of the exiled cards used to craft it. You may activate each of those abilities only once each turn, and I'll just throw Planeswalkers out there. I don't use Planeswalkers myself. A Planeswalker is a non-land card that you can exile with this that has an activated ability. Of course, loyalty abilities are activated abilities. This will allow you to do that. Maybe this would be a good fit in a Super Friends deck. Maybe, I don't know. Let's look at the other ability. Whenever you activate an ability that isn't a mana ability, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. So, of course, that works good in a whole lot of decks. And again, the Super Friends deck, now I can exile 4 Planeswalkers from my graveyard that have just died previously. And on my turn, I get to activate each of them. So that's activating 4 different loyalty abilities. Now, of course, the tricky part here is the loyalty counters, right? This doesn't have any loyalty counters on it, so you'd have to plus first. I'd have to use the pluses. The pluses would put loyalty counters on this, and then I would have to start minusing. But again, you're activating each of them, and also you're copying them, right? Every time you activate them. So if I get 4 Planeswalkers exiled with this, I can activate all the 4 pluses, and they will all get copied as well. So I get 8 activations essentially. So I'm going to pile the counters on this guy pretty quick. So very quickly I can get to the ultimate or the better abilities with this guy, right? So that's one way to use it. I'm sure people will figure out some very interesting way to use this card. It's pretty hard to flip. 9 mana is a lot. Again, the scenario that I came up with is going to be very quickly game ending. So 9 mana, I'm going to close out the game pretty quickly after that. I'd say is totally worth it in certain decks. All right, let's move on to the Skullpore Nexus, 6 green, legendary artifact. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Uh-oh. We've heard that phrasing before on, of course, the Great Henge, which is a super busted card in the format. So this guy ain't going to cost 6 green. It's probably going to cost quite a bit less. Whenever one or more other non-token creatures you control die, create a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness, each equal to the total power of those creatures. Wow. So basically you get a redo, right? So I have a Skur Tribelder. I just sacrifice it to go get a land. That, of course, is a non-token creature I control dying. I'm going to create a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness equal to the total power of that creature. So I'm just getting a 1/1 token. That's it. I'm getting a 1/1 dinosaur. Now that's not great, but it's just free value. If I'm in any green deck, like a green black deck where I'm sacrificing my creatures all the time, this is just free value, right? I have sack outlets. I sacrifice my one creature. I get a token that I can also sacrifice as well. Just great free value. But also on top of that, pay 2 and tap double target creature's power until end of turn. So what I can do, again, I have a Sakura Tribe Elder. I can activate that ability first. Pointing it at my Sakura Tribe Elder, it doubles its power to 2, and then when I sacrifice it, I will get a 2/2 token instead of a 1/1. So just helping out with the rest of the abilities. Obviously, I can just double target creature's power until end of turn. A lot of decks are going to be wanting to do that as well. Very easy to cast this for just a green and a green if I have a creature with a power of 4. I think it's kind of specific, but at the same time, you can probably put this in a lot of decks. A lot of dinosaur decks, a lot of maybe aristocrat style decks. Certainly this is going to see a lot of play. All right, Throne of the Grim Captain. This is a funny one. I'm sure it's gotten some buzz. It's an interesting card. I don't know how much play it's actually going to see. 2 mana, legendary artifact, tap, mill 2 cards. So you have a 2 mana artifact that if you are in a deck where you want to be milling yourself, this is a pretty good option. This is a decent option if you want to be self-milling. You might not be using the rest of the card, but it's pretty decent as a self-mill option. Craft with a dinosaur, a merfolk, a pirate, and a vampire, and pay 4 to transform this guy. So that's the part where it's like, all right, how often is that going to happen? Certainly there is no deck out there that is doing dinosaur, merfolk, pirate, and vampire tribal. That would be really difficult to do. It's possible that this will work in a changeling deck. I think that might be where people are looking at this. If I have a couple of changelings in my graveyard and a couple in play, I can exile 4 changelings here and pay 4 to flip this over. So maybe it fits in the changeling decks. It's a little tough to flip over for sure. The backside though, the Grim Captain, it's a black card. So again, just like I talked about with Hostile. And funny enough, I had so many people comment in that video. They're like, wait, I can't play Hostile on a non-black deck? Apparently they didn't know that, so I might have to cover that in a future video. That's right. That card is black on the back. That means it has a black color identity. I mean, you see it with this little circle here. That little circle there is a color indicator. That means this card is black. It can only go in a deck that has the color identity of black. Your commander has a black color identity, right? Whether it's mono black deck or a 5-color deck. So probably have to cover that in a future video. This card only goes in a black deck, guys, right? Legendary creature, Skeleton Spirit, Pirate, 7/7, Menace, Trample, Lifelink, Hexproof. Oh boy, that's a big scary creature for sure. So 7/7, Menace, Trample, Lifelink, Hexproof. It's hard to kill. It's going to be getting in for damage. It's gaining you lots of life. Is it worth it to flip it over? It's got other stuff as well. Whenever the Grim Captain attacks, each opponent sacrifices a non-land permanent. Then you may put an exiled creature card used to craft the Grim Captain onto the battlefield under your control, tapped and attacking. And I imagine there's going to be a whole lot of people probably asking their playgroup if they can make this as a commander because it is a legendary creature. I might be okay with that. You know, if somebody, maybe one of my patrons said, hey, can I make this a would-be commander, right? I'm building a deck around it. Of course, it would have to be mono black. So how many dinosaur, merfolk, pirate, and the dinosaur, pirate, and vampire certainly won't be a problem in black. How many dinosaurs are black? Probably not that many. Merfolk might be a bit of an issue. Again, you can do the changeling thing though, right? Because just flipping this guy over is pretty amazing. Giant scary creature that when it attacks, each opponent sacrifices an online permanent. And then you get to put one of those creatures that you crafted into play. You know, it's fun, interesting card. I don't know. How many people are actually going to be using this, trying to flip it? Again, we might have a few people out there building their entire deck around trying to flip this over. I think if you tried to build your deck around it, I don't think it would be that hard. Again, I would just be milling, filling my graveyard. As soon as I got those 4 creature types in there or changelings, flip this guy over, start going to town. Pretty neat. Again, is this going to be a popular card in the format? Probably not, but it's a fun one for sure. All right, and I'm going to end off with, again, another card that is a legendary artifact that has probably gotten a lot of buzz. It's a funny one. How many people are going to be using it? I don't know. Definitely got to talk about it, though. The Millennium Calendar. When you untap one or more permanents during your untap step, put that many time counters on the Millennium Calendar. So before we get to anything else, let's cover what's going on there. Whenever you untap one or more permanents during your untap step, if I sit there with a Fate Stitcher untapping stuff, that's not going to put counters on this. Only stuff untapping during my untap step. And as I talked about in probably a couple of videos now, you can't actually do anything during your untap step, right? Your untap step just happens. It's like snapping your fingers. It's a blink of an eye. Everything just untaps. you can't activate your Fate Stitcher during your untap step. So any way you have to try to figure out how to untap more stuff during your untap, it's not going to happen. Nothing happens during your untap step other than phasing in, and also I untap all my stuff. So if I have 10 things in play, lands included obviously, this gets 10 counters on it. Simple as that. However, there's obviously a lot more ways to put counters on stuff, including its own ability. Pay 2, tap, double the number of time counters on the Millennium Calendar. So my first go at this, I untap my 10 permanents, put 10 counters on this guy, and then I can pay 2, double the time counters on it. So now I got 20 on there. That's not bad. Seems like a lot. However, when there are 1,000 or more time counters on the Millennium Calendar, sacrifice it and each opponent loses 1,000 life. It's a funny card. I think it's boring 100,000 arrows, I guess, would probably be the biggest number we've ever seen on a card, but that's a name. I think this is the first card to actually reference a number that big on it. Helix Pinnacle, which I guess would be a similar card. You have to put 100 counters on it. That's another sort of neat alt win con. Again, some people probably built their deck around it, unless it actually fits in the theme of what you're doing. Is this going to fit in a theme of what you're doing? Funny enough, I have an Omarthus deck that I recently put together that is kind of a proliferate theme. I guess I could throw this in there. I also have Lux Artillery in there, which is a little bit of an alt win con, and just having a card that piles counters on itself very easily is great there because, of course, it turns on my Lux Artillery. So, again, outside of maybe I could win the game with this. And you know what the funny thing is? I've actually seen games where guys had more than 1,000 life. So it's not actually a guaranteed win. You could have the guy lose 1,000 life and he survives, but probably if you actually get there, you're going to just win the game with this. Certainly there will be people out there trying to make this work, trying to get the win here. It does maybe just fit in some decks that already exist though. Again, if you're already doing the proliferate, you might find room for this. Again, there's a ton of support there. If you have, maybe I got the nesting ground situation where I can move counters around. This is time counters. Those are pretty popular in the format. So it could fit in some other themes as well. It's a really funny, interesting card. And certainly there is going to be people out there that are trying to find room for this in their deck so that they can try to get that 1,000 time counter win. It's a funny one for sure. All right, that is mostly all the cards that I'm going to be talking about from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Of course, I have not touched on the commanders yet. Those are all the 99 cards that I am talking about. We got a lot of great ones. Like I said, this might be the best commander set we've gotten this year. A lot of really interesting, unique cards for the commander format. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below of these guys. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.